Blue marlin. Blue marlin is one of the largest bony fish in the ocean, and the size gap between sexes is dramatic enough to shape the entire fishery around it. Females grow to several times the size of males at maturity, and virtually every marlin over a few hundred pounds that anglers actually land turns out to be female, males rarely approaching the weight that makes headlines. The bill itself is a weapon, not a decoration. Blue marlins slash it sideways through schools of mackerel and small tuna, injuring or stunning several fish in a single pass, before circling back to feed on whichever ones are too hurt to escape. That same bill occasionally gets used somewhere nobody expects it. Documented strikes on sharks large enough to be a genuine threat, the marlin apparently willing to treat an approaching predator as something to attack rather than flee from, rather than reserving the weapon purely for feeding. They range across entire ocean basins, tracking the boundaries where warm and cold water meet, and tagging programs following individual fish over years have recorded some blue marlin crossing an entire ocean in a single lifetime, a fish willing to use its one weapon on prey, on rivals, and apparently on anything else that gets too close. Black marlin. Black marlin carries one of the most repeated numbers in all of sport fishing, 80 miles an hour, and almost none of that traces back to anything resembling a real measurement. The classic version of the story goes like this. A marlin gets hooked, makes a hard run, and someone watches line strip off a reel, estimates the distance, times it, and divides the two numbers into a speed. That sounds simple, until every hidden variable gets accounted for. The fish isn't necessarily running in a straight line away from the boat. It jumps, which means part of that swimming time was actually spent partly out of the water. Line drag, stretch, and an angler's own reaction time all get folded into a number that then got repeated for decades as settled fact. More recent analysis revisiting the claim has pushed the likely real figure for black marlin closer to 30 miles an hour, a third of the legend. What isn't in dispute is the fight itself. Black marlin is considered one of the most physically demanding billfish to land, capable of sustained, punishing runs that have worn out experienced anglers well before the fish shows any sign of tiring, regardless of what its actual top speed turns out to be once someone finally measures it properly. White marlin. White marlin is the smallest of the Atlantic marlins, and that size puts it in a strange position, small enough to be mistaken for a juvenile blue marlin by an inexperienced angler. Similar enough to striped marlin in the Pacific, that identification sometimes comes down to a single detail. White marlin carries a rounded lobe at the front of its dorsal fin, where striped marlin's equivalent fin comes to a distinct point. Genetics has since complicated that identity even further. Some researchers analyzing white marlin DNA have found it sitting closer to striped marlin than the two species' completely separate common names would ever suggest. And documented hybrids exist between white marlin and Atlantic longbill spearfish, two fish supposedly different enough to belong in separate genera, still similar enough underneath to occasionally interbreed in the wild. That confusion matters more than it would for a more abundant species, because white marlin populations have declined enough to earn a near-threatened listing, and getting the identification wrong in a fishery with size and species-specific regulations has real consequences beyond an argument at the dock. It's become one of the more popular light tackle billfish, specifically because its smaller size makes for a genuine fight on gear too light to seriously test a full-grown blue marlin at all, a fish whose family tree turns out to be as blurry as its resemblance to half its relatives. Round-scale spearfish. For nearly a century and a half, round-scale spearfish existed as little more than a footnote. First described from a single specimen taken near Madeira in 1841, it went unconfirmed by another positively identified individual until 1961, and even then, only 4 specimens total had ever been examined. Most of the scientific community assumed it wasn't a real species at all, likely a misidentified white marlin, a case of mistaken taxonomy, rather than something actually swimming out there on its own. Genetic testing in 2006 proved everyone wrong, and what it revealed next was the real story. Round-scale spearfish wasn't just real. It was hiding directly inside decades of white marlin catch data, visually similar enough that commercial and recreational fishermen alike had been calling it a white marlin without anyone catching the difference. Follow-up analysis of western North Atlantic catch records found that round-scale spearfish made up roughly 27% of everything previously logged as white marlin, meaning meaning more than a quarter of an entire fishery's stock assessment for one species was quietly composed of a completely different one nobody had confirmed existed for 140 years. The two can be told apart by the position of the anal vent relative to the anal fin, longer branchiostegal rays, and a lack of spots on the dorsal fin. But none of that was being checked before 2006, because nobody knew there was anything to check for. Round-scale spearfish remains listed as data deficient by the IUCN today. Striped marlin. Striped marlin hunts in a way researchers only recently started to understand properly. Groups of striped marlin surround a school of sardines or mackerel together, but instead of a chaotic free-for-all, individuals take turns attacking. Drone footage published in 2022 confirmed real coordination in how the group divides access to the bait ball, with competition determining who gets the next turn, rather than every fish charging at once. The stranger part is how they communicate that coordination. Striped marlin can flash vivid color across their sides almost instantly, using specialized skin cells called melanophores paired with reflective crystal structures, essentially tiny built-in mirrors the fish can reveal or conceal. For years, researchers assumed those flashes existed purely to disorient prey, since the eyes of mackerel and sardines are specifically tuned to detect exactly that kind of color change. Newer research using drones found something more layered. Pairs of striped marlin approaching a bait ball stay dull-colored during the approach, and only the lead fish lights up brightly once it's close enough to actually attack, meaning the flash isn't just a weapon against the prey, it may be a signal to the marlin's own hunting partner about which fish is about to commit. Sailfish. The sail is the first thing anyone notices about a sailfish, and it isn't decorative either. Raised while hunting, it likely helps herd bait fish into a tighter group, making individual targets easier to isolate before the fish uses its bill the same slashing way blue marlin does, cutting through a bait ball before circling back to pick off the wounded. That much researchers largely agree on. The speed doesn't get the same consensus. Sailfish holds the most famous speed title in the ocean, and it might be the least settled number on this entire list. The 68-mile-an-hour figure everyone repeats traces back to an early 1900s Florida fishing competition where an angler reported a hooked sailfish stripping 100 yards of line in 3 seconds, timed by stopwatch, on a fish that was jumping for at least part of that interval, under conditions nobody would call scientific today. Modern tagging has only deepened the disagreement rather than resolving it. One study using electronic accelerometer tags recorded sailfish bursts up to 78 miles an hour, while a separate, independently conducted study measuring the same species found a maximum closer to 23 miles an hour, a gap too large to explain as simple measurement noise. Whatever its real top speed turns out to be, sailfish backs its reputation up with the same tail-walking, repeated jump fight tarpon is known for, which is most of the reason it remains one of the most sought-after billfish on Earth, despite rarely being kept for the table. Longbill spearfish. For years, longbill spearfish didn't really exist as its own line item in Atlantic fisheries data at all. Sailfish and longbill spearfish catch records were lumped together for stock assessment purposes until 2009, which meant an entire species population trend was invisible, folded into a much more abundant relatives numbers simply because nobody had built a system to separate the two at the point of catch. That's a strange fate for a fish that isn't actually rare in any absolute sense. It's the smallest Atlantic billfish, rarely stretching past 10 feet including that elongated bill, and it holds far enough offshore in open water that boats targeting marlin or tuna catch it incidentally rather than by design. But incidental catches rarely get sorted carefully, and a species that looks similar enough to something more commercially important at a glance can spend decades undercounted for no more complicated reason than which box got checked on a logbook. Longbill spearfish carries the same bill, the same heater organ, the same basic hunting build as every fish on this list. It just spent a meaningful stretch of fisheries history existing on paper as a rounding error inside somebody else's population count. Mediterranean spearfish. Two fish can look nearly identical and still turn out to be distant relatives, and Mediterranean spearfish is the clearest case of that anywhere in this family. Visually, it's easy to confuse with round-scale spearfish. Similar build, similar range overlap in the eastern Atlantic and Mediterranean itself. Genetically, the two aren't especially close at all. When researchers actually sequenced almost both species, Mediterranean spearfish came back most closely related instead to longbill spearfish, a fish holding water on the opposite side of the entire Atlantic Ocean. That's the kind of result that scrambles the intuitive assumption most people make about identifying species, that fish, sharing the same water and the same general shape, are more likely to be close relatives than fish separated by thousands of miles. Mediterranean spearfish and round-scale spearfish disprove that by sitting right next to each other in the water while sitting much further apart on the family tree, while Mediterranean spearfish and longbill spearfish do the opposite, holding opposite sides of an ocean while sharing a more recent common ancestor than either does with the neighbor next door. Short-bill spearfish. Every other fish on this list carries a bill built to slash sideways through a bait ball, and the length generally scales with the size of the fish behind it. Short-bill spearfish breaks that pattern. It carries the shortest bill relative to body size of any billfish, a genuinely different proportion than its relatives, rather than just a smaller version of the same weapon. What that shorter bill actually means for how the fish hunts isn't fully settled, but the timing lines up with where it lives. Short-bill spearfish holds the Pacific and Indo-Pacific, hunting smaller, faster prey in more open water than some of its Atlantic relatives, conditions where a shorter, less unwieldy bill may trade off some slashing reach for better maneuverability, chasing something quick rather than plowing through a dense bait ball. Genetic analysis has confirmed it as clearly distinct from Mediterranean spearfish. Researchers comparing mitochondrial DNA between the two found fixed differences at 17 separate positions, evidence that the physical difference in that bill reflects a real evolutionary split, not just a regional variation on the same basic design every other spearfish on this list shares.